Okay, so it's now being recorded. Welcome to the Tuesday, 13th of October, Loaders Team meeting. I am Jacob with panelists Jai, Guy, and James. Jai, do you want
Yeah,
to, yeah, do you want to take over? I believe you have 2 items to present.
sure. We had some WASM ESM update from Guy before, and we're moving on to other items. I guess the first one, well, it's ordered differently, but I guess we can start with the universal loader hooks. So rebase that thing a bit. Um, I think I still have some questions about there are still some unresolved questions there. The blocking one is whether I should take a URL or function, because I kind of went back and forth with this until I realized with the other item, which is Node.rc, is actually going to be somewhat awkward if you have a URL based API, which is like recursively preloaded by default. If you do that and then you have a Node.rc that also does preload by default recursively, then you have a double registration, which is going to be weird. Or like it's
Sorry,
possible to do some
why do you have a double registration?
uh because the Node.rc thing is supposed to allow you to preload the file
Mhm.
recursively in all workers
Mhm.
or anything spawned if your current working directory has a package.json which points to this thing, which asks Node to preload the file.
Ah, got
And
it.
if in that preload file you do module register hooks, and that module register hooks register a URL or specify a URL combination to a loader, and that thing is also recursive, then you have double recursive registration.
So
Um,
don't do that.
and another thing is uh, the module register API that's based on URLs are not really working well for universal hooks, because that assume, first of all, it's using the import condition, which is not really a thing for universal loaders. It's like doesn't really care. It's neither import nor require. It's a third thing. Um, and also there are some weird peculiarities with if this thing is supposed to be loaded by both,
Mhm.
uh, that is not working quite correctly, because ESM resolution and CJS resolution work differently. Uh, so it kind of ends up with um, if you like if you load this from if you do module register hooks in a
Mhm.
CJS module, like how it's supposed to
Just have a
resolve this
couple
URL.
of clarification questions on the Node.rc. Firstly, is the default preload behavior to preload across every single effectively execution context?
I guess it's supposed to be configurable, but the default should be like applying to all.
Good. That makes sense. And then can it be an ES module or common JS module, so I can point to anything that the module system can load?
Yes, basically everything.
In that case, I agree that this functionality, if it is proceeding, effectively replaces the same functionality that we were looking to do with the explicit register. And I think the concerns around an explicit register are then entirely invalidated if that becomes the pattern. I think the
Yeah.
only additional thing, so like I'm more than happy to withdraw my previous request that we use the URL registration system if the Node.rc system based on a specifier is going to proceed as the sort of standard pattern here. Because the important thing I always wanted to see was just like, as long as the default path or an easy configuration path involves being able to configure it across all different contexts. My only concern ever was that we could possibly miss contexts. And if that is the path, then that seems preferable because you can do a lot more in a general module. And if you know as a guarantee that it's going to run before any other of your modules. One thing I would add is if we do, so the first thing is like we should be sure that this node RC direction is definitely going to happen if synchronous hooks are going to change for that. And then secondly, it would also be nice to have some kind of lockdown function for the hooks as a kind of a guarantee where you can say, you can call a function and you can say, lock down my hooks, and no one else is allowed to register hooks anymore, so that you can create a guarantee in the environment that you can actually create invariance of the resolution and security context that you know for sure about that can't be changed during the runtime of the application. For example, you could imagine registering a I guess I don't want to call it a loader, but it is a loader, right? Registering a preload script that sets up all your hooks and then locks down the hooks, so that, but the default keeping them open, I'm also fine.
Are you thinking to bake this into the like customization loader API, or are you thinking this should be something that should be in permissions?
It could be any type of API that's just allows you to lock the hooks. So maybe it's wherever we have the register hooks, there could be like a lock hooks call or something. Yeah, but it also that we don't necessarily need that to start, but it would be nice to see.
Well, I think we have maybe two different use cases, like lock hooks that is called sort of dynamically at run. That's like, are there any restrictions on who can do that? Is it just like whoever calls it first wins? Whereas like permissions is sort of file system hierarchy based. So it's like you can say that like this thing is allowed to have hooks, and that's the only thing, and nobody else is, or like these places are where hooks can come from.
Yeah, that's another nice model as well. If permissions has that level of fine-grained permissions to be able to identify hooks, I'm not sure if it provides that level of granularity. I haven't looked at the recent design.
I believe it does, because that's how, or at least if it doesn't, it easily could, because that's how much of the stuff in the permissions API work.
Yeah, that could also work well. Yeah, I mean, I think lockdown is a fairly well-designed concept, also with the globals, you know, from the kind of like SES kind of direction and stuff, where you can have the preload script do a lockdown of the global and the freeze intrinsic stuff and all that. So I think it's a similar mindset, but there can be many ways to achieve these things. I think I'm not specifically saying it needs to be this API, but like exploring ways in which those permissions can be mitigated is, I think, the key thing.
Cool.
Joy, what was your question that you were getting to though?
Sorry?
You said you had an unresolved question about what to do, and I don't think you quite got there yet.
Yeah, about the import conditions, but if we are not going with a URL-based registration, then the resolution of that loader will not be a problem, because we would then not have to resolve that loader.
Cool.
Yeah.
Is there, aside from like the principle of it, is there a particular reason that we should do one versus the other?
You
Like,
mean
is there a particular impetus that it should be URL based, aside from much of ESM is URL based, but this is not specifically ESM?
I guess another reason that I was thinking about like agreeing to it was the ability to identify a hook. one of the best, I guess, identifier for a hook would be the URL of the thing, but then thinking twice may not be really the best thing because it's actually not the URL, it's actually specifier parent URL combination,
Mhm.
which is not deterministically mapping to one, especially after after you already have some loader out there. So it's
Mhm.
not actually like the definitive thing to identify a loader.
Hmm.
So I still am inclined to some kind of symbol that you can use to deregister myself, or maybe something else that's returned that's part of the JavaScript API, but the URL doesn't seem like the best thing. Also, if we go with, like, for example, for like the wrapper hooks that pilots or import in the middle that provide, they have like an internal URL, like their own URL, which is a loader in that case. So like how is a external like the end user, if the end user wants to cancel this, how are they supposed to know like this internal hook, super hook that they use? So that seems to be a bit weird if you think about it. Um so yeah, I'll still being inclined to doing a function-based hooks because that just seems more natural. And you can compose
So
this with other preload APIs that we're thinking about, especially because currently it seems most people are just expecting to do dash R or dash import, the dash import.
Mhm.
And it's like it's kind of like people actually get surprised if you cannot inherit them this way,
I
rather
cannot inherit
than
what?
inherit the hooks via the command line flag inheritance currently.
Mm.
People currently just rely on the command line flags inheritance.
Right.
And if you have a different mechanism to do this,
Mhm.
and then people then accidentally inherit the flags, they kind of need to cancel out the flag first. Because you then otherwise you get double registration again.
Yes, I thought there was some discussion about this some months ago about op thanks, James. Opting into like inheriting the hooks. That it would be an option that you would specify when you're spawning whatever it is. Did that go anywhere, or did I imagine that?
I think that probably was following the discussion of whether loader hooks should be single, like
Mhm.
should everyone share the single loader hooks. That's like why it needs to be
It's like,
like a global thread over there, because you can otherwise you have double registration.
I think like there was this idea that like loaders were the system for um controlling all hooks in Node. And if that was the
Hmm.
case, you have this kind of like special hooks environment, it runs on its own thread. It's like the special, like privileged you know, instrumentation system, and it has all the hooks for all the different subsystems and everything in there. And I think what's happening now is that's no longer the model. These are just module hooks. And there's another kind of system that you configure where you have your preload script that's going to do all your other kind of stuff like that. And because it's on the same thread, we can do that now. And we don't need to have this sort of inversion of control in the API where you export your hooks. We're now doing implicit hooks, so you run your hooks. So we can basically say that we've inverted the control, and we've said that the hooks that you register, by turning the registration into an explicit function, we're saying that it's no longer that module is no longer the hooking system. The hooking system is the thing you preload. And that when that becomes the pattern, you don't want recursive registration. You want singular registrations always, because the recursivity is already handled by the preload nature. And as long as that's the direction the overall pattern is heading, that we're not in general encouraging libraries to call register arbitrarily, that like the pattern we're encouraging is like a library shouldn't be calling this. This should be called by the preloaded script. And ideally we should even be able to say like only preload script is allowed to do it, but actually almost like what import maps do is they say there's a period when you're allowed to get import maps, and there's a period where you're no longer allowed to change the import map. And so like something similar where like, well, actually that's changing, but something similar where like you can say that there's a period in time where now your arbitrary npm packages can't just add hooks because you've already loaded things. You've already registered on your workers. If you now start randomly adding hooks, it's not going to be registered on your workers. It's not going to be registered. You're going to create diversion of your resolution context. And those are all the concerns that I had previously around this with the recursive and, and the URL questions. But if so that lockdown, I think, is actually a key thing, that there should be a lockdown functionality, or maybe even like, yeah, I'm the thing that scares me is that like that we're going to encourage people to hook things arbitrarily in npm packages, and you'd have no idea what your import system is going to do, because people have just they're adding hooks in, they're removing hooks out. You don't know what's happening on the workers. You don't know what if it's in sync with what's on the main thread. You've got no guarantees. You can create no higher order analysis or conception of what your application's doing. And that's the thing that worries me. But if you have a single preload script that you know is running everywhere, if it's locked down and that's the situation, then you have the ability to actually be able to reason about what modules are executing, that they're the same modules that are executing between different contexts, and that you know the behaviors that you've set up for those modules. And so it's just that overall pattern that we make sure we steer the ecosystem down, sort of the sort of the path that's going to work well with security and analysis guarantees for the most part.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the security aspect because that's not in the thread model of Node. So I don't think like the lockdown would be more like for correctness instead of safety. I would not like actually throw any safety guarantees over there, because that's again going against the thread model of Node. We basically trust all the modules. Like basically trust the file system. But yeah, I would agree it would be useful to have for correctness. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was that format of that RC thing. Which I have a draft, very naive draft in the issue, at the end of the issue. Which is kind of like a very naive version of INI representation, like the kind of thing that people do with INI, but converted to JSON, because we don't want to just randomly start supporting a different format, which people might hate. I mean, people also hate JSON, but JSON is not going away anyway.
The devil we know.
So I have a draft over there. I'm not sure how flexible this is, or like how are there any ideas of like whether it should be more flexible in certain situations. Some people mention the requirement of having this work with scripts, the npm scripts, the the scripting package JSON, which I think is a pretty good point. That's why we do need sections, even though it's up to the script runner to match them with the script targets. But that's a start, and I am curious if there are any thoughts about any other thing that you see is lacking in the very naive schema over there.
Is
It's
this
at the end. This
is
is
this
like
the one that you're talking about?
yeah, this was a previous draft before we thought about sections.
This?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, cool.
I guess the bottom line is that we'll have version fill, so we can do whatever we want without breaking anyone.
Sorry, you said we have version what?
We'll get a version field, so we can support multiple versions of this at the same time. So even if we make breaking changes to this, we can just convert that to the new format.
You're talking about we would version the format
Yeah,
of
version
Node
1.
RC. Yeah. But this is in reference to like the format of Node RC.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Are these brackets, are they part of the like a special name itself, or are they like a placeholder?
They are sections. So
Okay.
basically, for example, so without section, it applies to all targets. With
Mhm.
sections, it will be up to, for example, a task runner to decide
Mhm.
whether it should apply. So I guess there will need to be some interaction between task runner and node for this. For
Mhm.
example, if you do node dash dash run
Mhm.
test,
Mhm.
then you'll apply
Grab this.
test.
Mhm.
If you know dash dash run test coverage, it should apply. The both should apply. The subsection and the top section should both apply.
Test and test coverage.
Yeah, and preload, which is like the global one.
Always, yeah. Okay. Okay, and so you're proposing putting this sort of hierarchy into the syntax of the name.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
It doesn't really have to be dot. It can also be column. I guess it's more common to see that in scripts files, but then we are kind of modeling this with after INI files, which typically use a dot
Okay.
to specify subsections.
I'm thinking people will probably be quite familiar with something like concurrently, and concurrently uses a colon. I don't know, actually, I don't know if that's required, if that's just a convention. But yeah, it's very common to for these sorts of things to use a colon, and then you would do like test colon star.
Yeah,
But is there, so these are flat. I think there was some discussion higher up in this issue about nesting, but that it was better to leave it as flat. So you could have, for instance, test, and then inside of test another object called coverage, or something like that. Was that indeed discussed?
all right. We can
And
also have test and then inside it
mhm.
bracket coverage.
Yeah, because I'm thinking then we don't have to worry about any kind of syntaxy kind of thing. It will be familiar, like
Yeah, that would be
listing it
similar
inside.
to Tomo, I think. That's what
Mm,
Tomo supports if you have indentations.
okay. Like I don't have a particularly strong opinion. They all make sense to me. Just whichever creates the least problems.
Yeah,
And I
one
don't want to have a,
thing
yeah.
Hmm?
the one thing that was thinking about was for example you see array there, uh like array of strings. I'm thinking maybe that could be shorthand. So if you don't care about whether Amaro is loaded by default, like the Amaro that supports tsconfig, for example,
Mhm.
if you don't care, then you use preload and put Amaro in a string in an
Mhm.
array, and which means you are going to use default configuration. But
Mhm.
if you want to customize a model, for example, you want to, I don't know, ask it to not support transform, you put the item will be a object. So you suppose it supports like overloads of the same thing. And typically if you do like a string, it's going to be like a shorthand for just using default setting. And if you want to extra configuration, you add a proper object with a different key for that thing.
For what field would that be?
For example, preload, I guess it would be main Amaro. This would be an item in
Okay.
the array. It would be main. Maybe main is not the great name, but I was just thinking about package main field.
And would you get, so in the start example, would Amaro also be imported? So it's composing by default, or is it replacing?
Sorry.
In the start example,
Ah,
would it be preloading both Amaro and instrumentation?
they're both. It's kind of like have you noticed instrumentation.ts? It's not instrumentation.js. So yes, both. Because the Amaro one is at the top level, it's the global one.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say you should, if you feel brave, argue for TOML in Node.js.
It's actually not Tomo, it's still JSON. We're just like
Yeah, no, I'm
trying
saying
to
if you
introduce the
feel like
concept of
a
section.
fun fight, try and actually do TOML. But I'm not.
Having a bad day and you want a few rounds of bare knuckle boxing is what he's saying.
I guess we can at least the first iteration is only going to support JSON. Maybe there will be some pluggable way to support other formats. I don't know. But this is going to be what we support for now.
Okay.
It's
Cool.
good.
Like
Go ahead.
if you really want to use Tomo, I guess it's always possible to like have this and then you convert it to a different format.
Cool. Do we have any preference for any of the things that any of the options that we've discussed? Because I think otherwise, this is a pretty non-controversial proposal that everyone wants. So it's like, can we have this tomorrow?
I guess another question I have is what else do we want to support other than preload and I guess options, so exec options.
Conditions might be a nice thing to add, the conditions flag for Node. Like in test, you might want a special test condition.
Would that be an array or?
Yeah, an array of strings.
I'm trying to think how that would compose with, for example, preload, because preload would also be subject to conditions.
I guess the same way as environment. Like, would preload get the environment at the top level?
Yeah, I would expect that. So like if there was an environment at the top level as a sibling of preload Amaro, that Amaro preload would get those environment things, and then things underneath him would also get them.
You could even have a open square bracket preload and be able to define a special environment for the preload itself.
Oh God.
Yeah, we can go reflection with this.
Is there a way to keep this simple to begin with and expand on it in an iteration?
Yeah, that's why there's a version field. And I guess like we'll just have limited supported fields in the beginning. I mean, preload and environment will be pretty obvious. And then we can, those are going to be some minor anyway.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking like if we added this ability of like bracket preload thing, if that was not something that was already supported, that sounds like it would be a minor, so we wouldn't have to pump it. But we wouldn't necessarily have to be thought through for version 1.0.
Just one more clarifying question. Sorry, for the start, what is the expectation of what Node.js command would run for that start case to be triggered?
You mean start would be you mean the start trigger? That would be npm, like the script field. That's the same as test. It depends on depends on your task runner.
So like, for example, node -- run start, that would
Yes.
invoke this start.
Yes.
And
But
the start, would you specify a script, or is the preload the script? Would there be preload and main or something?
Sorry, what?
I guess I was just a bit unclear on like if preload is the preload list, what are you actually running? Does there have to be a run target as well?
So you're saying like node -- run and you give it nothing. does it just do the preload?
Right. That or do you do node dash dash run app.js and you actually specify the entry point?
I guess no dash dash run and you don't do anything, that will throw an error. It'll tell you to give it a value. It's just like a runtime configuration doesn't change the execution mode. And the modes are the sections are going to be selected by the task runners, which means as far as no core is concerned, we can only provide limited support in no dash dash run. But if you use, of course, npm run, that would need to be supported by the task runner itself because Node doesn't really have that information.
And if you're not using node dash dash run, it'll still run the top level preload, right?
I suppose there would be some kind of API or a CLI flag that a command line tool would need to pass to Node to select a section.
What I mean is if you're not selecting any sections of the Amaro preload, if I just have like an application, I'm in a folder and I've got one of these files sitting around in that folder and I do node source app index.js, I just run that file. Will it pick this file up and run the preload, or does it only do that when I'm using the run flag in there?
It will load by default. It
Okay.
will only load the top level thing, and the sections
Yep.
are only the sections are used if you explicitly specify which section to pick. And if you're just doing no something there, then there's no session. If you do no, I guess dash dash, no dash dash RC section, whatever thing, equals I guess test the coverage. You'll select test and test coverage, and CLI tools can pass this into Node. And no dash dash run would do this thing by itself. But otherwise you just don't have sections. Sections are more or less depends on who actually runs Node.
Okay.
I can't remember. Have Isaac and Mael chimed in here or seen it? I'm just concerned we'll be like, okay, cool, this is good. Other runners, here you go. And they'll be like, wait, we have lots of problems.
I think it would be nice to define a main as well as a preload for the cases where you just want to, like, if you did like run build or something, like it's nice to indicate that you're doing node build.js or something.
Isn't that supposed to be in package.json instead of this?
Okay, so this is complementing the package JSON, it's not replacing it.
No. It's going to be you're going to have a field in a package.json that points to this file, which means this file can be named anything, but we recommend download.js
Not doing a default
parsing.json.
name. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of complementing the package JSON workflow. Interesting. I mean, one thing I would
Kind of like,
suggest. Yeah, I really
just-
like the cloud burner stuff.
I was just trying to say that's kind of like a requirement because otherwise we will have a startup hit by trying to check another file during startup, like recursively. But package.json is already something we check anyway, so for type. Sorry, what were you trying to say?
I really like the task runner stuff. Like, I think there's like, we all know that there's like gaps there, and it would significantly improve the experience for Node.js users to have these kind of things. It's difficult to do it like the for example, the preload thing. Like, if you're using your npm script, you can you write multiple node invocations on the same line for a build script, right? You like node build.js and node post build.js, and specifying a preload against that is quite tricky. So there's some things that need to be worked out there, and I would just encourage to avoid getting too deep into those discussions, to try and say that this task runner stuff is like a follow-up proposal to an initial just very simple env preload version, and then say like we're going to turn it into a full task runner, and just get the initial proof of concept together without necessarily doing all the task runner definitions initially, but then follow up with that so that there can be a faster development process.
Yeah, I guess the initial version probably won't even have sections. Sections will just be ignored. They are going to, in the first iteration, it's just going to be, I don't know what this is. I only recognize preload. And then we'll have sections, but how to apply, like correspond, how you run Node with sections, how you select sections is the only exception in Node is node -- run. But otherwise, the sections are really up to whoever runs Node that passes command line flags.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So you would update your build script in your package.json to have a -- run flag, and then better integrations can be figured out over time from there.
Cool.
Yeah, or I guess we just don't even have to do script runner integration in the first iteration. It's just like something that people ask, and we think we need to at least think about a way to make that work, which is sections, which is also a very common concept in these kind of configuration files. Anyways, so how do you correspond?
I'm gonna share my task runner in the chat because I love it. I wrote a task runner called Chomp, and I love the traceability of mtime checks, like the traditional makefile stuff, but just posting it in there, I love task runners. Like if you can figure out how to like trace dependencies and stuff, like that's a whole nother world. But yeah, a lot of thoughts on task runs.
Cool. Is this going to get incorporated into Node?
I just use it for my private projects. It's never got much traction, but I really like the invalidation semantics, which I just thought might be worth sharing, but it ends up in some other places, you know, and then things like that.
This feels like a parallel thing, because I can imagine, for example, other heavier runners like Gulp or Grunt could make use of some sections, but it kind of basically it's kind of like implementation defined. So you can have these fail just like people add all kinds of stuff to package.json these days anyways. So you'll be up to them to decide whether they want to, have these sections, and you make use of those sections somehow. It's kind of up to those runners.
We're down to 4 minutes. Do we have time to just briefly discuss the require asm interop story? I guess we can't get very far on it now, but or shall we pick it up in 2 weeks?
I can hang around for a while. I guess we have like because we started around 17. I guess we have 17 more minutes, unless someone else is going to use this account.
I was just going to say we often get stomped at the end of our meeting, so Let me check to
No,
see.
we are too late. No one, no one else is doing another one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can stick around for a couple more minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I should be able to as well. Yeah, I guess so. The main thing is that when you have require of ASM, it's a new type of interrupt in a sense, because I can be requiring a common JS module, and then I could also be requiring an ES module. And typically tools need to know if they are dealing with an ES module or common JS module in their interop patterns. And now I'm obtaining a module where I didn't know, where I don't know ahead of time if it's going to be one module format or the other. Now, we don't have this problem for import of common JS because of the fact that we went with the very well-defined default interrupt pattern, which is just like common JS is the default export, and you don't need to think further than that. And the benefit of that is that you can always know how to interpret a common JS module in those patterns. So if you had a require, you know how to turn it into an import if you want to convert common JS into ASM. And so I guess the argument is like more and more tools will want to convert common JS into ASM, and this is what JSPM does. JSPM is getting about 3 billion requests a month. It's used by Framer, Rails, Symfony. It's not a small project, and we convert common JS into ASM to be able to support import maps for common JS dependencies. And in order to support that in the new require ASM interrupt, we will need to be able to detect whether a module was that was required when we convert it into ASM, whether that module is CommonJS or ASM originally. And so there's just a whole class of interrupt patterns on both ASM importing and the CommonJS converted into ASM doing imports. And you have both sides. So you have both the module that's been converted from CommonJS into ASM and imports to CommonJS and ASM from those modules, and imports of those modules in ASM.
Sorry, what are you saying? Are you saying ESM?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So we can do like a private pattern that is not like Node.js specific, but the problem there is that often you want to then run the code again in Node. So you can actually run JSPM in Node as well. And so like ideally it's nice if the pattern is not just a browser specific pattern, but if it's a pattern that can also work, because basically like the idea is like, if you're building a dependency into an ES module, can you do that in a way that can be supported across platforms, and that there's an interrupt pattern that'll work for that? And obviously we want our interrupt patterns to be as wide as possible. So when I'm converting my CommonJS into ASM, it's nice if I can do that in a way that will still be supported on Node when you run that application on Node. And so like the simple starting point is if I'm requiring a CommonJS module and I want to convert that into an ES module and I still want to require it and get the same thing, it's nice if because CommonJS module can support more types of export types than an ES module, which can only be a namespace. It's nice to have the ability to change the representation of a module when required under require-ism. And so the idea was that we put a flag on any ES module, and when that flag is detected, we can update the require-ism algorithm to say, instead of getting the namespace or doing the ES module check, you check this flag first. And if this flag is true, then you have a representation of the module to use in the require interrupt. And then the other interrupt case is the kind of CJ, the ESM module itself. When we import CJS into ES modules, we need to be able to detect those modules as well in interrupt. So this was the case I described in quite a bit of detail at the top of the issue, where we very much need a way to detect that. And if we can't detect it, then we can't support converting CommonJS into ES modules in a way that works properly. And so that's basically having a converse flag on the wrapper that is created for importing a CJS module into ESM, so that you can tell that when you convert a CommonJS module into ESM and it's actually importing CommonJS, it knows how to reflect that CommonJS as the original CommonJS instead of the ESM wrapper, because otherwise you get the ESM wrapper and your interrupt breaks. So those are the two cases. And if we use the same flag for both cases, the wrapper representation and the check for require ESM, that solves transitivity in the sense that you can have a dynamic require that doesn't know what it's getting, and it can get a wrapper that someone else imported as ESM and pass it into that dynamic require in the bundle, and it would still know how to interpret it. So you can actually have build tools like Rollup define a dynamic import wrapper that knows how to work with these patterns as well. So you get the full transitivity, and it's also like, if we don't have that transitivity, JSPM would basically need to define both flags on the module. So you start to just sort of decorate these modules with a whole bunch of things, and it introduces more complexity into a already complex area where there's great simplification in just treating transitivity as part of the problem to begin with. And so where we are in the discussion, Joey, I believe, is that you're open to both of these. We're still agreeing on a name for the flag on the wrapper and in the require ESM interrupt pattern. And Joy also made the argument that putting this flag on the wrapper that is given to an ECMAScript module. So today, when you import CommonJS into ECMAScript, you get the wrapper and it doesn't have any flag on it. And if we add this new flag onto it, that we are changing the interface, and therefore that is a breaking change in Node.js, because we're going to have this extra export flag. And Jory made the argument that this is a major change because many applications will consider that interface, or have tests that test that the shape of the interface that would change. And I guess I would like to revisit if it definitely is a major change, because if it is a major change, it means that we have to separate the require ESM situation, which is being backported, from this new wrapper flag, and we're then have this intermediate node versions where the transitivity is not solved, and we would need to separate the PR into two PRs. So I would just like to know if we can have that discussion again, and if that's definitely the way that it needs to go, because that's a bunch more work to just separate this into two separate features. Or if we could find agreement that maybe this isn't a major change and we can land it as a single PR that can join with the require ESM backporting. And so I'm happy to any more detail on the interrupt cases and stuff as well.
So the main reason is that testing would be checking the shape exactly matches. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Not necessarily. You can check whether the keys are what you expect. Like you have a library, you have a um you have certain common JS exports. You want to
Mhm.
make sure your ESM consumers actually get
Mhm.
the right keys, because import ESM is import CJS is
Yeah.
guessing. So you want to make sure that your ESM consumers get the right keys.
Mhm.
Um, so
So,
if you throw in a new key, that will be a breaking change.
but why? Because is this in a very, very like simplified terms, basically running object keys and checking that the output of that array exactly matches some predetermined array value.
Yeah, I guess if you want to check that the guessing is right, you want it to be nothing more, nothing less. You don't want it to guess
I
something weird.
No, sure. I'm just trying to see at the problem here, because if you're trying to ascertain whether it's a CJS versus ESM thing based on those keys, then I think a well done test does not need to say that the keys are an exact, no more, no less match, just that it contains these things. And if there are more, then that is okay. And I think then if a test is saying that this is an exact match of these things, that's unnecessarily strict, and the test is thus poorly written. So if that is the case, then I say it's not a breaking change, that it's breaking poorly written tests.
Can we just ask about what the require ESM rollout strategy is at the moment? So we've got the backport PRs. It's being backported. How far back are you looking to backport it at the moment, Julie?
18.
18. And then there will be an unflagging PR, and that'll also be backported?
Depends on how it goes after 23. But the unflagging is planned to be done at 23, and we'll think about whether we want to backboard this.
Are the users that you've been considering for the backporting, are they satisfied with having it behind a flag, or are they very much looking to see it unflagged on the older Node.js versions?
Well, people wanted to to be unflagged on even though they're unsupported versions, but that's a different discussion.
So it'll be 18, 20, and 22 is the only gap. And then the question is, do we want to potentially make this change that we could claim is non-breaking that may cause people to have to change their tests? Or do we just say that those three versions are going to be on a sort of a different, they won't have this interrupt story, and this interrupt story only picks up in Node 23?
I think if nobody complains, that's fine. It really depends on who actually complains, like not being able to interrupt.
Could it be an option? So yeah, maybe the right approach is just to separate. I think the thing that makes me uncomfortable about separating the PRs is like it's hard enough to get consensus on one PR, let alone two PRs. And it's like I think it's really important that we get both. And but maybe the right strategy is to split it into two and try to backport it. And if there are any concerns, back off the backporting, maybe?
Yeah, I would say so because it's controversial because it's a major. But if you're splitting a semi minor out of a semi major, that kind of like that's different because semi minor is obviously going to be less controversial than semi major.
Yeah. I guess the other option could be to just do both on node 23, and then there will be like a require asm interrupt change on node 23. That's different to require asm interrupt on node 22 and earlier because of this flag being picked up. But just to ask your preference, Jory, which do you think would be the best option to work with your current require asm strategy?
I would say it would be useful to have that the marker in ESM to allow unwrapping default. I mean that is useful regardless of the interrupt thing. That's like a thing that library authors who write in ESM who want to ship ESM can make use of. The interrupt pattern is not really a thing right now because you're only going to hit this pattern when people start to have CJS compiled to ESM, and then you are having it's not a immediate thing you're going to see because it's going to come from a package that you cannot control that does this transpilation, whereas the marker is more like a thing that you can immediately run into because you're the author of a library. You're going to run into this by yourself.
So maybe the justification is that the interrupt will only be a problem later on, primarily. I mean, well, JSPM has the problem today. But because of that, it could be acceptable to say that the marker is only going to be node 23 plus, and the CJS wrapper marker, and then the sort of we need to name these better, but then the current require asm check, interrupt check, as you say, if it is useful, then maybe just splitting them up is okay. Okay, I will do that. Then we just need to finalize the name. Right now, I've got it called _CJS module. The immediate use case where you kind of define an ES module that you want to customize its CJS representation, you would write export const CJS module equals true, and then you would write export default and the actual module that exports value that you want to provide to CommonJS. Joy was suggesting we don't need a double underscore because we can just use a name that is unique without needing that disambiguation. And that it might be useful to name it something that describes what it does. So something like CommonJS use default or something like that, like something that tells you what it is. My preference is slightly towards I like the idea of explaining the intent, but because I also want it to be symmetrical in the transitive interrupt, that it should be the same name that's used on the wrapper. That the name should not be too specific to the scenario as well. So you know, CommonJS default export equals true, I think works for both directions quite nicely. But we just need to kind of agree on a name there and come to a conclusion on that. I can get a thread going for us to just bike shed that through, maybe on the Loaders repo. Joy, do you have any other feedback on the naming discussion?
Yeah, I think I suggested something like unwrap single default or unwrap default. I guess for people who are authoring ESM, they kind of need to be aware that this will lose all the named exports. This means if you get required by ESM, you lose all the named exports.
So CJS, was it CJS unwrap default?
Yeah, I guess that works. Basically it's about unwrapping default.
And that will
And that's,
cause
yeah. go.
the named things to not happen, or it will cause them to happen.
It will cause if you have export const CJS unwrap default and you have other named exports, the named exports would not be surfaced to require ESM because require ESM would just make it will basically make require something is the dot default of that thing, dot default of that namespace. So you will lose everything else.
And if you think about it, if you have a ESM CJS wrapper, the namespace exports are superfluous because they're copies of everything that's on the default. And so that's the transitivity where you would actually, you can pass it around back and forth and you will get the right object. But as a module author who's writing ES modules that are going to be used by people who want to be able to require them, you can tell them export the CJS unwrap default equals true. And then your default export will be the thing that require ESM consumers will see. They won't see the module namespace anymore.
Okay, and then the value of default will potentially be an object with named keys.
Yeah, so you could have any type.
It
Okay,
requires
cool.
the library author to, if you do have some kind of named exports, like or equivalent, it requires you to put them onto the default export. So you cannot do like export default 1, and then export const hello equals world, and expect that to work anyhow because default 1 is not an object.
Okay.
So it'll allow require ESM to return the 1. But if you wanted to return the 1 and the hello, then don't use this. So.
Okay. This is sounding like a foot gun.
Yeah, that has been difficult forever. There are a lot of style guides that suggest you not to do both.
No, but like, why would I ever want to opt into this?
I guess
So-
that's useful when you do have this. When you do have a single export.
For example, if you've got a package today that exports a class directly to module.exports, and you want to upgrade that package to an ESM version, but you maybe still want the require users to be able to get that class directly, you can do that upgrade path. And in fact, it does open the door for a conversion of a package into ESM being a non-breaking change because you can be able to support those. Now, obviously, we don't say it's a non-breaking change, so we don't encourage that, but you can keep the same types as you change your package from a JS test.
Okay, so for the general user, probably don't. But if like you're doing something special, here you go.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
I guess it's
Cool.
mostly for packages.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay, CJS unwrap default.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
But also, were you going to open up the discussion and then propose that?
Yeah, okay. I'll get a naming discussion PR, CJS unwrap default in the list, and then I'll split the PR into 2. one that can be backported with requireism that supports this unwrapping for requireism, and then another one that adds it onto our ASM wrappers that we can say is Node 23 plus only. And I'm happy with that.
Okay.
Thanks so much. And thanks for
Thank
going
you,
over
guys.
time. Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Later. Dewey. Bye.
Bye.